Sherlock Holmes versus Jack the Ripper. Given the time that Sherlock Holmes is set in, and that the infamous Whitechapel murders of Jack the Ripper were happening at that time, this is actually a very interesting crossover, so to speak. It is also a key part in the timeline of the Sherlock Holmes games. In fact, it is an event that a lot of people probably would have loved to have seen. And the fact of the matter is that a lot of people figured Sherlock Holmes would have figured out who Jack the Ripper is. And I keep hearing they have now figured out his identity. I'd have to look it up myself. But at the time the game was made, the identity still was unknown, and you're talking at least 100 years, 120 years maybe, between when the game was made and when. Actually, about, 120 years. So, what is the story? Well, being at the time of this recording, first in the Sherlock Holmes timeline from Frogwares, it is the most well-known mystery of the time, and the perfect one for Sherlock Holmes to get into. A serial killer with a mysterious identity that taunts the people. Yeah. And to the credit of the team, they did take information that was known at the time about possible suspects in that. But they also delve into issues that were plaguing society at the time and were still plaguing society today. However, it was very well done. It's also listed as one of the more graphic of the series. And given what Jack the Ripper did to many of his victims, yes, this is understandable. They do mix it with a bit of humor, some dark, some downright funny. But it is a beautiful game in the way it's done. And this is actually involved, considering how the series has been progressing and walking around in open areas, it's actually quite nice to be able to walk around in an area that is very well designed, with the graphical limitations of the time. And yes, the games do get graphically better from this point on, because again, the abilities are there. But Sherlock Holmes works to solve the Whitechapel killings. He does rely on Watson to help him. And we meet some interesting characters. Some good, some questionable. And you see Holmes' sense of justice play out. In the story, of course, we run across body snatchers. We also run across some theft from the hospital schools and the schools, doctor schools, I should say. We mention a epidemic that was at the time of syphilis, and it plays into the storyline. And with each of the games, they did introduce some new aspect to the game series. And with the fifth one, they introduced a more scene recreation to help figure out things and sorting out a timeline of when events happened. And such, which does set things right, which helps you figure things out. How could one person be mistaken for Jack the Ripper and another? So it was a very interesting setup. Yes, it was a bit more graphic, and one of the most graphic things, I think they let that more be implied than actually shown. When Sherlock goes to investigate the one crime scene, he is in shock, and you never see it from his point of view, which I think is a blessing. And it's part of why I think I enjoy the Sherlock Holmes games from Frogwares, because they improved with each entry in the series. With the fifth game, and the fifth game is the earliest in the timeline. And this is by a fact that, and if you want to intersect it with how things happen, the next game of this series that I'll cover will cement the timeline. And when every other story happens, I say this one is the only floating point, but can happen before a key event. I'd have to look into the history of the actual stories, timeline of stories. But it's a very well done game. Very well done. Now, I played through this. It was actually the second Sherlock Holmes game I got. The first one was gotten for me by my late wife. And after I got this one, I think I got the collection of the first three games. It could be I got the collection first and then Jack the Ripper, but I could be mistaken. I'm honest about that one. And the premise behind it, I did like it. Having Sherlock Holmes going after Jack the Ripper. It was perfect. Now, it even says at the beginning of the game that this is based on speculation, not actual facts about the identity. And I will admit, as things play out and all that, in some ways I kind of feel bad for the figure who is eventually revealed to Jack the Ripper. And part of that is because you don't expect it. It's sort of sad how things came about for him. And as you go through the series, you will encounter other figures and get them straightened out. Get a man who is accused but isn't the criminal free. You run across the sensational journalism that was and still is a little bit rampant. Well, I shouldn't say a little bit, a lot. But it shows the lengths in which Sherlock Holmes, being a can be a master disguise, can be a very caring, compassionate person, and can also be one devious son of a bitch. In fact, part of my humor and laughter in this game came from how he took care of a rather mean-spirited working woman, one who has an apparent allergy and hatred for cats. I still laugh over this. Having the irregulars find all the cats they can, and then meow. It's enough to cause a ruckus and a distraction. And it couldn't happen to a nicer person. uh, yes. And, there is one thing that I have to point out with this series, especially with this title, is that while they did step up their game, crime scene analysis, putting information together, and you put information together correctly, and you can get your results. They put in what turned out to be a very difficult puzzle. And I think that's the only part I really didn't fully record. And a problem with that is, and it's something I've seen in other games, they design something with specific hardware and limitations in mind. I saw it happen with Final Fantasy Legends, known to other places in the world as Saga, where they designed a leveling system to work with the processing speed of the unit, which means if you play through the game, and like with that one, if you played through with the original Game Boy, you had no problem. But if you played through, say, on a Game Boy player plugged into the GameCube, I never saw anyone try it with a Super Game Boy on the Super Nintendo. But the leveling up happened a lot faster, which was a problem. And there's a puzzle in this game that requires you to make proper markings on a map. Now, given that when it came out there were different maximum settings on monitors and all that, it was probably designed to work with a set setting where you have to draw certain shapes, and even if you draw them to the expected size placement on the system, it's not going to match up. So it's a little bit of a trying thing. And I had to fill with about an hour or two, even with a walkthrough, to get the right placement. And of course, I didn't record all this because I didn't know how long it was going to take me. I could take me an hour, could take me 2 hours to get it right. And I forgot about that from the first time I played this game. But it can be very aggravating. And I think that's the only aggravating part of this game. While your deductions lead you to who is Jack the Ripper, and you get a poignant ending where things are sorted out, and you get an explanation at the end of the game why this story was, quote, never told. And that's another thing that I do like about these games, is to work it into the timeline of the stories. It comes up with a reason why the story wasn't told. Now, this was, at the time, this was the third game I knew of when I got it. And I was intrigued by what they did, because the previous two the game I got and the one that I knew came prior delved into crossovers of sorts. So seeing him go after a legendary figure like this, it was interesting. It was intriguing. Now, if you are a Sherlock Holmes fan, I do suggest getting these games, especially this one. And if you are a fan of real life mysteries, this is again another one because the speculation and how they tied it up and used actual knowledge like the Dr. Tumblety, I think I said the name right, who was one of the main suspects. They did a very good job at tying everything in. And to be honest, I would definitely recommend this. It's definitely a fun game to play, especially if you love Sherlock Holmes mysteries. And I think they do a truer viewpoint than some of the more made up story, like what other writers have done. And thanks to Hollywood, we've gotten a view of what Sherlock Holmes normally looks like. And the simple fact is, the outfits you see him wear in the later games of this franchise are more akin to how he dresses than what Hollywood has given us the envisionment of. Of course, that envisionment also has played into a lot of figures and all that. But again, this is a recommended must play, in my opinion. And that's all I have to say about Sherlock Holmes versus Jack the Ripper. And I thank you if you've listened to the end. I try and get these retrospectives up every Saturday. Usually premieres at 10 a.m. Eastern Standard Time. Or 10 a.m. in Eastern Time Zone. And if you've listened to the end, thank you. Please subscribe to the channel. You can check out some of the other things. You can check out my playthrough of Sherlock Holmes vs. Jack the Ripper and other Sherlock Holmes games from Frogwares. And you can check out some of the other videos that are up on the channel. And until next time, this is Rich Kale here on YouTube, Rich Gen X elsewhere. Have a good one, and goodbye.